Hello, ladies. Today, our assignment is to work on improving our basic sewing skills or the quality of our sewing. Um, we need to understand that if you're sewing for yourself, it's really up to you how perfect you want your project to be. But when you're sewing for money, you're sewing to sell it to someone else, then it becomes their standard of quality that you need to measure up to. You worked so hard on the tote bags that we did for the Craft Lake City, and I was really proud of how most of your bags turned out. But there were a number of them that needed to be improved, and they were rejected, and so we couldn't sell them to the vendor. We've decided as volunteers and directors that we really want to emphasize this week the importance of improving your quality of sewing. Quality matters because it's going to make a difference on how long the project lasts. If the seams are not sewn correctly, the clothing particularly is not going to wear as well. If it's something that is being sold to another person and the sewing lines are off, the measurements are off, the back stitching isn't neat, those are the things that people will notice. And if they see one bag that is really well sewn and one bag that has these other maybe minor issues, but issues nonetheless, that person is going to select the product that is more well made. And so today I want to go through a couple of suggestions on ways to improve your sewing projects. Okay, first I'd like you to take a look at some commercially prepared bags, ones that I purchased from a store or received as a handout from someone. Just take a look at the way that the reinforcing stitch has been done on this handle and the way the sides of the handle have been stitched. Additionally, the casing is perfectly straight all the way across to the other handle that is equally neat in the way that it's been stitched. Now, I realize that it's a little bit hard to see these because the thread has matched so closely to the material. That's actually a good hint. If you match your material to your thread, you're going to have less chance that stitches that aren't quite straight are going to show. Now, I don't know who made the individual tote bags, and so I don't want you to feel like I'm picking on any one of you ladies. I'm just pulling bags out of the tote that we had of reject bags. Take a look at the way these handles have been stitched versus the way the commercial handle has been stitched. Your goal when you're selling to someone is to make your bag look like it was professionally done, not like it was done in a hurry and without much care. Two areas of the bags that we noticed that were particularly common in not meeting our standards were the way the handles were sewn on and the way the casing was done. Okay, if the casing line is not straight, again, that is going to be very obvious to the person who is looking at your product. If you have thread that is not the same color all throughout the project, that also not only shows that you haven't spent much time looking at the overall design, but it also makes any stitches that are out of line show up even more. A third thing was the number of back stitches or overlapping stitches so that the thread looks like a nest or a tangle rather than a smooth line of stitching. The next two areas that I'd like you to consider are the seams at the bottom of your bag where the two different colors come together. This particular bag is a really good example of how that intersection or that seam line should look. The two seams match virtually perfectly. There were many other bags where that intersection line is not well done. This intersection, you can see the lines are off by at least a half an inch, and in addition, the bag was stitched with the top stitching around this intersection was stitched on one half of the bag on the pattern side, and on the other half of the bag it was stitched on the solid side. Okay, in addition, this stitching line, as you can easily see, is not evenly spaced. This bag, the intersection was off dramatically, and the bag was ironed so that the seam was up on one side and ironed down on the other, which creates a fold going down on the right hand side and up on the left hand side. Okay, people are going to notice that. It makes the bag, again, it just makes it look like you don't either care, didn't have time, or you need more training on how to make this look more professional. Next, when you're stitching the side seams, we want to make sure that they are tight, smooth, and that the stitching or the edging has been caught all the way up. Now, there is no hole in this section. It's just that the seam allowance became skinnier, and so it didn't catch the serge part of this particular bag. All right, let's take a look at some equipment that may help improve the quality of your sewing. The first and maybe the most important is decent measuring tools. Now, there are lots of ways that you can measure. You can measure with a metal ruler, a plastic ruler, a measuring tape, but really for what you're doing, when you're measuring small distances under 6 inches, your most handy tool is going to be your seam gauge. And I'm not really sure that all of you understand how the seam gauge works. But if you are going to be measuring a 2-inch space, let's use the edge of this material as my example. If I need to measure from the edge of that cloth over 2 inches, I definitely can use my ruler. I definitely can use my measuring tape. But this slide that's on the ruler really helps to mark and identify what measurement you've chosen. So if I were hemming something, sorry that this video will move around a little bit. If I were hemming something and I wanted it to be 2 inches tall, I could just move that blue guide over, measure from the bottom of my material, and then mark in at the intersection of that blue piece. I'm sorry, there we go. I want you to know that I'm much better at sewing than I am at making videos. So I've got my measurement marked. It's going to stay in place. And now I've made a mark on my material, so when I go back, and I would do that all the way around the material, I would then fold it against that line, and then before I do anything else, I would iron that in place. Okay, you want to have a set of pins, thread that matches the project that you're doing, and then needles that are the correct size for your project. Just a note on thread, if you can only get 4 colors of thread, a gray and a black, this one is supposed to be kind of a cream color. It shows a little different in the light in here, but it's a light tan and a white. You can sew almost anything with just those 4 colors, but be consistent throughout. If you use white on the handles, then you need to use white on the top stitching. Okay, the next is that you need to have the right size needle. For the projects that we're doing, we need a heavier needle on these tote bags. You know that you can get needles that come in a variety of sizes in one package. The lower the number, the finer the material it sews. The higher the number, the heavier the material. So this particular package is 14. That would be for the weight that we're doing most of our bags out of, or for jeans, heavier pants. This one is a 16, and you could get needles all the way up to 18. And those would usually be used for things that are like upholstery, car seats, those kinds of things. Okay. Okay, remember that you also need to have an iron. You're going to be using this as much as your sewing machine, almost. If you don't have an ironing board, that's fine. Just use some cotton fabric, not polyester, not anything that will melt, but a cotton. A bath towel works well, and just stack it up so that it's nice and thick, so that none of the heat will go onto your carpet or your counter, wherever you've put that material. Okay, there are so many ways that you can mark your material. I'm just going to show you 4 that we use frequently because they're inexpensive and they're easy to find. You can use a regular pencil, but remember that if you use a regular pencil, it often will not wash out completely out of your material. So be cautious where you mark with that. You can use a marking pencil that you buy at the fabric store, and generally these pencils will either just wash out the mark that you made, or they sometimes will fade as you iron them, and some of them just fade over time. Okay, so that's a good one to use, and these pencils come in all different colors. One that I use most frequently is called Tailor's Chalk, and this is just a piece of it that I've broken off from a larger section, and I like to break it off because I like the sharp edge. And so with this one, okay, so with this tool, it's really easy to mark a straight line. It's easy to mark just a dot, except that didn't show up. It's easy to mark just a small section. But again, I really like this because I know that I can draw a straight line just using that sharp edge. Tailor's Chalk can be a little bit expensive, but they last just about forever. But you also can use a bar of soap and just cut it so that it's kind of thin. And then you would use it just like you would the Tailor's Chalk. You just don't want to push down too hard. Right there where I pushed hard, I got a lot of dust. But I can just brush that off, and then I would still have, oh, sorry guys, I would still have just a nice straight line from the soap. Okay, let's start repairing some of these bags. On this first one, as you can see, the first thing that I've done is that I've just unstitched part of the side so that I could get to these edges that were folded over incorrectly. Remember they had the deep folds in them? So I've undone both sides. Then I've taken my iron and I've ironed this out so that it's really flat. I don't want any kind of fold in here. Now, I don't know how well you can see it, but after I ironed it, I made a little yellow line where the original stitching was. And so that's how far off the fold was. It was 1.5 inches. So this was folded up clear up to here like this. Okay, so that definitely needs to be repaired. All right, now I'm going to top stitch, and I want to top stitch just 1/4 of an inch from this line or this seam. Okay, now it's tricky because when I go to my sewing machine, of course, my material is going to cover up my guidelines. All right, so I'm going to show you a couple of tricks that you can do to avoid that problem. And all of them involve measuring and marking. So the first thing is I could fold it over, measure it, and put a dot with my pencil. I could fold it over, iron it, and make a mark with my yellow chalk. Okay. Another way that I can do it is to take a piece of this particular tape that you can buy at the sewing store, and this tape is exactly 1/4 of an inch wide. So if I line that up with the folded edge, then I'm going to be sewing on the right hand side of that tape. And then the last one that I'll show you in just a second is a variety of sewing machine feet that will help us to sew straight. On this particular machine, you can see that there are 3 little tiny marks on the inside, and those little marks are used for adjusting your seam width or your stitching line. Right now I have my needle set to the far left, and if I were going to keep the edge of the material with the edge of my foot, that would give me a 1/2 inch stitch. If I move my needle over to the right until my needle is lined up with that mark, maybe one more, that's going to give me 1/4 of an inch stitch. And if I continued over to the next mark, continued over to the next mark, then that would give me an 1/8 of an inch stitch. So I'm just using my foot as my guideline. Okay, so right now I'm set on an 1/8 of an inch stitch. The side of my material is even with the edge of the foot. Now I'm going to adjust it so that the needle goes to the middle. Okay, that's going to give me a 1/4 of an inch stitch. I'm still keeping the material next to the side of the foot. And then the last one, I'm going to move it as far to the left as I can. Okay, and that's going to give me a 1/2 inch stitch. Again, I haven't changed my guideline really. I've just changed the position of the needle. I don't know how straight this is going to be because I'm sewing with one hand videotaping at the same time, but let's take a look. Okay, so now you can see that just by changing my needle position, I've changed the width of my seam. Okay, and I think that's a really good foot to use when you're trying to top stitch something. I've drawn an X pattern just like we use when we're stitching the handles onto the bag, and I wanted to show you how to do that without actually sewing on the handle, just to make it a little easier to see. Remember to start exactly with your needle into the corner of your rectangle or square. Do no more than 2 stitches of back stitching. Follow along that line and slow down as you get to the opposite corner. The last stitch or so on the corner you should just take by rotating your hand wheel. Adjust your material if you need to, so that the needle goes right into the corner of that rectangle. Now you're going to raise your presser foot, rotate the material, and your needle line should be right back on the guideline that you've drawn. Okay, down to the other corner. Slow down as you get there. Last stitch or 2 by rotating the wheel. Needle down, presser foot up. Needle down, rotate. Okay, and on that one I can tell I need to go just one stitch more. So there we go. That's better. All right, now I'm just going to go up to the top. And again, I'm going to back stitch, but I'm only going to do 2 or 3 stitches at the most. Stop right on the corner, don't extend the line. Now on these new bags, or these repaired bags, to save time, we're just going to have you do the rectangle or the square outline. You do not need to go back and sew the X through. But if you were making bags for someone else, I would recommend that you do the X, because it does make the bag or the handle stronger. So to do the X, I've done the same idea as I did with the outside edge, and I'm going to start exactly in the corner with a needle down. I've got a line to follow, just 1 or 2 stitches of back stitch. Okay, then don't continue sewing across the line, the top or the bottom. You can just pull some extra thread that you will cut off later. Go to the other corner and do the same thing. Get that needle right in the corner. Back stitch a little bit. Okay, now if you've done it correctly, not sure how it's going to look on this side because it's the back side, but you should have a rectangle, a square, with very little back stitching, no loose threads. And you can see on mine, it would have been better if I had done less back stitching on this corner. The other 3 corners I think look better than that one. It's not enough to unpick it, especially because on the front side it looks better. But if you're going to be perfect about it, you want to, again, watch out for that back stitching. Make sure that the stitches connect to each other, that there are no spaces in between the X stitching and the outline stitch. Okay. That's all you need to do for your handles. So the finished bag, I need to cut my threads, of course, but without the X in the middle, the finished bag looks like that, with no extra back stitching in the corners. Right here it went crooked because I did take the presser foot off, but that line should be perfectly straight. Okay.